Well, we made it. We got through unofficial E3 week. Summer Game Fest is what we're going to focus on specifically today. I know there was Xbox Showcase and State of Plays and everything, but what I thought would be great is to first of all talk about what we thought of the show, what we enjoyed seeing, and then David, you're going to take us through some of your findings so far. So I suppose first question I have is if you had to summarize Summer Game Fest this year in one or two sentences, what would you say? Start with Alex.
One or two sentences.
If you need to pass, we can go to David.
No, I've got this. Exciting, though full of very familiar sights for me.
You're trying to write haiku with it?
Yeah, a little bit. It was really good. I really enjoyed the show. I watched the whole thing live. It just parts of it were a little bit maybe less exciting than I think maybe they were meant to be for me.
I thought it was pretty slick. I didn't watch it live. I was following it. I went out for a nice meal on Friday night. But I was following it afterwards, and then I caught up over the weekend. And I thought it was slick. It usually is. I think every year they do get slicker. In terms of announcements, obviously, which is the and what games are featured, what everyone's interested in. Again, some huge franchises, some exciting reveals, but I guess perhaps no major surprises. I think there's nothing really really shook everyone. But I thought it was solid overall. Quite enjoyed it.
Thank you for both keeping that to one or two sentences. So I think for me, I have the opposite take to you two, in that I thought it was overly long, as is always the case with Jeff's shows, but also I found it quite dull. Like I just did not. There were definitely moments, don't get me wrong, which we'll get to in a moment, but I think overall, if I had to summarize it, it would be bloated and poorly paced, I think, which is usually the case with a lot of Summer Game Fest, Opening Night Live, and the Game Awards. But I mean, in terms of theming of the show, when sometimes when you have Nintendo Directs, there's, this is the cozy game direct, or if you have a State of Play, it could be this is the action adventure direct. Do you think there was some common themes from this year's show at all? Some sort of, leaning toward a certain type of game or a certain message?
It felt very story driven. Mm-hmm. I feel like an awful lot of games, both the big surprise ones and a lot of the sort of more, like I said earlier, sort of more comfortable, sort of cozier ones, were all very single player generally, but also just very heavily leaning on having some sort of narrative, carrying the game in a way that wasn't just based on what's the cool new mode. We didn't have a lot of extraction shooters. We didn't have a lot of battle royales, things like that at all, really.
Apart from Fortnite.
That was
that's going to be in every show, I think, till long after we're dead.
Yes, oh yes.
I thought there was decent variety, actually. What was interesting as well is like there are quite a few sort of racing type-ish games as well, which you don't often see. So, given we've had a quite strong few months for racing titles, it's like it does feel like we're in a good moment there because there's been a dearth. I think that sort of just helps give a little bit of variety to all those shows because we often see a lot of shooters, action adventures, RPGs, often lots of similar titles. I did think that sort of give it a little bit of variety.
It's interesting because I thought it lacked variety because after watching the Xbox Showcase, and that to me has been my favourite show of the whole week. I got a better sense of variety from that show. Yes, it had your typical shooters, but you saw Crazy Taxi, bright and colourful arcade series. You saw a new Spyro the Dragon. It had a nice mixture of genres and types of games. Whereas, and this is something that I feel tends to be the case with Summer Game Fest, is a lot more darker, a lot more gritty games. And as for me, they start to blend together unless you recognise them exactly. Don't get me wrong, there were a few like Hot Wheels, which are more colourful and more family oriented, but for the most part, as I say, I felt it lacked it lacked variety or enough variety to keep me interested. But enough about the bad. But in terms of your favourite moments from the show, any that spring to mind?
I did make me chuckle when Snoop came on stage.
It's always a great time.
No, I said highlights.
Yeah, but it's just you got to have a few light moments, haven't you, to break it up. I think otherwise it just becomes one big sort of long, not advert is probably the wrong word, but I think those things do keep it a bit fresher and provide talking points, which is what they want to create. Right at the end of the day, people are talking about it.
It's funny, I was watching it with my wife, and then when Snoop came out, she said, "Do you reckon they'll bring Tupac out?" And I went, I don't think they will, unless, who knows, AI maybe. But
That would be stranger than heaven.
yeah, I wonder how, like, if they're getting, you know, a sound alike, or if they're using AI to mimic the, you know, his voice, what they'll use. But
yeah, it'd be interesting to see if there's a state would agree to that. But you would maybe, yeah.
any other standout moments for you?
I think the start with, you know, Resident Evil Veronica for me was a great way to get started. And obviously, it had been remade, expected. I think we even called it out, didn't we, last week? So, you know, that eeriness, creepiness, I thought it was a good little intro to the show, and I think that seemed to get the audience pumped. I know there were a few other moments during the show where you could see the audience reacted. Turtles, it was another one. But yeah, I think that Resident Evil Veronica for me was a great way to kick the show off.
And see, and I think that's where my problem came from, was open very strong. To open with Resident Evil, considering they closed with Requiem last year, set, I think, an expectation of, wow, we're going to see some stuff. But for me, it just fell flat after that. And even when they revealed Final Fantasy at the end, great, we're getting, you know, the trilogy complete, but did we need 4 or 5 trailers on it and have it stretched out as long as it was? It's the same problem that we talked about in the office with Sony, where they had that 20-minute demo of God of War and they had that Wolverine demo, and it just you felt those minutes. And I think there's a better approach in which you could, I mean, people know what Final Fantasy VII is. They know there's you know, we want to see the final one. You could have had that trailer and that would have been more than enough. And as I say, I think it just lent then to that whole pacing issue that I've found with a lot of those shows over the years.
Yeah, we often get a lull, don't we, at some point around the middle. Sometimes it's a little bit later on. And we have seen some shows where they've actually, you know, spiced up the third quarter. When we've done some analysis in the past, we broke it down into quarters. But like I say, yeah, maybe there was that little bit of a lull this year where you sort of, you know, struggling to get people's attention back. And, you know, across nearly 60 titles featured across the show, I think you know, it is difficult to keep that pacing as, you know, swift as you'd like, maybe.
How many do you reckon you could name right now, if I was to tell you without looking at the table in front of you?
At least my phone's off.
I think it would be just maybe slightly above 10 for me.
Yeah, about a dozen, I would say.
But
I want to feel like I'd do more, because I watched it and I wrote while I was doing it. I was like making notes and things, but I feel like I probably match maybe a bit more. But
it's like the 50 States game, isn't it?
Yeah,
can you name?
I can probably do more. No.
And I mean, yeah, Alex, what about you?
I think any good show does 3 things right. All right, I've thought about this. Obviously, 2 of them are starting and ending right, and I think they did that fine. I think Resident Evil Veronica and Final Fantasy VII Revelations. Mm-hmm. There's so many of those now. I think they're perfect games to do that. They're fan favourites. They were semi-expected, so people are already hyped going into it and coming out and going, where they're going to be, sort of thing, and then they get what they want. And people who weren't expecting obviously get a surprise. And the third thing, which I think Jeff does well in his shows, is he sprinkles in not silliness per se, but some levity. And I think some shows like the Xbox One you mentioned and State of Play are good. They keep content coming, which is what we want. But there are, for the length of some of them, they sort of drag a bit when it's just game after game with no break. And there was something very special about Jeff Keighley having an on-stage conversation with the Jigsaw puppet.
I knew you were going to.
That really did make me go, okay, we're in a Jeff show.
Well, he's got to have a puppet in there. If he couldn't get the Muppets, so he needed someone in there.
Yeah, I'm assuming they're saving them for Gamescom.
Yeah,
must be.
I was excited about a new Saw game, but I'm not sure how you make a multiplayer element out of it.
Well, I've been reading about it.
Okay.
So it's another one of the 1v3 sort of horror things which we've seen before, which is fun, maybe a little bit overdone, but it's again just the presentation of seeing it on stage and having something interactable, I think drove it harder than it would have been otherwise.
It's sort of like more like those old school E3s where you would have celebrities come out, you would have goofy interactions, things like that, which you just don't get with these perfectly presented, pre-recorded broadcasts.
No, exactly, and that's part of the charm.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I missed that as well. But we'll talk more about Saw after, because I want to know more about that. Okay, so moving away from our impressions of the show, David, did you want to talk a bit more about some of the findings that we picked up at Fancensus?
I mean, I think overall, in terms of some of the big picture show findings, I said earlier there was nearly 60 titles, which is pretty standard now for these sort of events. I think we've had a few which have dipped in a little bit under for Jeff's shows. Six of those were on the sizzle reel, so debatable whether you would include them or not. We had over 40 publishers feature, so we did have a number of publishers who featured more than once. So Sega being perhaps the standout there in terms of featuring multiple titles. I think overall it featured 5. And then obviously you've got a number who just have the one title there. So in terms overall, again, a little bit like what we saw from the State of Play, we did see, strong big hitters. Nearly 2/3 of titles were A or AAA titles as we define them. Not so strong on the indie title front. Again, we're probably looking about 8 titles overall actually on the indie title front. It's not really the show for it, particularly over this weekend, I think, where we had Future Game Show the following night, which was dominated by indie titles, and there's so many other showcases going across the weekend as well. So in terms of overall viewership, obviously there's been some stats floating around already. The show did pretty well. I think in terms of all the shows, of Jeff's shows, it's highly up there. Game Awards is always the strongest in terms of overall viewership. But these do tend to stand out higher than the State of Plays and some of the other first party shows. But we're looks like about 25 million views of the live stream itself, and obviously the VOD views off the back of that. So these are people actually watching the full thing rather than just extracts, and that's on YouTube. Probably around half as many of those on Twitch again. So a strong showing there. In terms of top titles, if we look, say, let's just take press headlines because it's always a pretty good barometer, I feel. Any idea what the top 3 might have been for press headlines?
Veronica's
got to be in there.
Revelation.
Yeah, so Veronica was second. Final Fantasy VII Revelation was first.
Right. There's got to be a twist.
And then it gets a little bit tighter after that. Those two stand out.
I mean, it won't be
Alien Isolation 2.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Really?
I wasn't second. Yeah.
Yeah. So interesting. Like you've got Stellar Blade, Blood Rain, and Guild Wars 3, and then, like I say, it gets pretty tight. So again, all big hitting titles at the top. All part of big, huge franchises, which we do tend to see, and we saw that with the State of Play. We've seen it over the weekend as well. So it is, trickier. We don't see as many of the new IPs which really push through these days. So yeah, overall, it's the start and the end which were reserved for the top 2 slots. We see on the press headlines side of things. If we take a look at another area which we've been tracking a lot more of lately is AI. So when ChatGPT, what are they serving back? So they're taking the same source as what we're using for press, etc., but they're taking the wider web as well. They even take things like Steam sources such as Steam store pages. And we asked it a bunch of questions. What was talked about from Summer Game Fest, what games featured, and again it is that top 3. There was a pretty consistent response. Final Fantasy VII Revelation was top, pretty much featured in all responses we received back. Alien Isolation 2 and Veronica second and third, and Guild Wars fifth. So there was actually quite a strong correlation there.
Was there a mention of Cuphead, just out of interest, because as a smaller title, but it still had quite a big feature, being the second showing?
Yeah, on the AI side, it was actually joint fifth. The Mighty Cuphead Adventure was, and I thought, we mentioned it was a strong start, but it's almost like going from the sublime to the ridiculous, wasn't it, when you had Resident Evil Veronica going straight into the Cuphead game. So, a little bit of variety early on. And then we go down to the social side of things. And this is where you do get things a little bit mixed up. Particularly amongst the established franchises, things like Fortnite always creeping because you've got that constant chatter around Fortnite, and obviously you've got such a big gamer base there that sometimes it can dominate. So that does come in higher. It skews skews a lot higher on some of the social side, particularly Instagram. TikTok, it's always high. YouTube as well. If you look at things like X, Street Fighter 6 was really strong, Control Resonance. So, interesting to see some of these titles coming through stronger on social media than they are on the press side. So yeah, we do get a big variety there, depending on, depending on the sort of platform, people are expressing themselves on.
And of course, it wasn't the only show last week. Do you have any findings in terms of how the show compared with State of Play or Future Game Show or the Xbox Showcase?
Yeah, I mean, overall, again, if we take like overall views of this stream itself, not looking at individual titles, then Summer Game Fest was stronger. Probably looking at around twice as many views of the stream overall. In terms of individual titles within that, from what we can see, from a press headlines point of view, actually the titles perform better the top titles perform better at the State of Play than they did at Summer Game Fest. So, God of War, Lothy, and Marvel's Wolverine in particular were the two standout. Two pretty huge gaming franchises there, and it looks like they're gonna cut through more than the top two titles did from Summer Game Fest in the press.
So those are first-party titles. What would be interesting to understand is how third parties compare, because of course Sony and Xbox are going to do their own thing because they know they can. They're the platform holders. But from a third-party perspective, did you see how that compares for the top-performing third-party from a State of Play or Xbox Showcase?
Yeah, I mean, third actually was Tomb Raider Legacy of Atlantis, but Control Resonant was actually fourth there. So that came in fourth. Raymond was fifth at the State of Play. So, and then Summer Game Fest, 007 First Light, which I think obviously perhaps there's a little bit of bleed and overlap with its, still its hype from its launch. Was it 2 weeks ago its launch? It's not too long after. So, interesting point about trying to keep that momentum going by, doing something pretty much straight away after you've launched. So I think, pretty interesting move there, and it seems to have, reap benefits for it. So again, just keeping that conversation going, putting it into sort of a wider audience's mindset was, perhaps a pretty clever move. But yeah, some of the big titles, I think, State of Play maybe had that little bit more room to breathe. I think this weekend, obviously, so much activity on social media across the press, so many different titles and, some websites competing for attention and articles competing, whereas State of Play, had a few days breather, so it's perhaps not a surprise to see, State of Play titles perform pretty well. And we spoke about this at the end of last week. I do feel it is a clever move to go that 3 days earlier, wasn't it? I think it sets the week up nicely for everybody. But those titles, there's 30-ish titles at the State of Play, and I just feel like they have a little bit more opportunity to, I guess, get their rhetoric out there, get their profile out there, where they're not necessarily competing with everything else across the weekend.
Cool. And so I suppose in closing, what would be a couple of your bullet point takeaways from everything that happened last week, and maybe around primarily Summer Game Fest?
Yeah, I think what was interesting for Summer Game Fest was a theme. What came up at State of Play was so many titles being released during September and early October. I think we about 16, 17 day window in some State of Play of the feature titles. 40% of those are going to be the second half of September and the first couple of days of October. So that wasn't necessarily the case, I think, Summer Game Fest. I think some of these titles were looking further ahead, which I thought was quite an interesting point. Whilst there was, some of those titles were announced for September, October, a lot of the titles had a sort of a lot longer lead time. So that's perhaps something it's augmented that busy schedule. Everyone's trying to avoid November apart from Barbie, is all right. But yeah, it didn't feel like the Summer Game Fest doubled down on that, what we'd seen previously in the week. But I'd say overall, it does feel for me, it felt like Summer Game Fest in particular built on the excitement of State of Play. I personally like the format of dress shows. I think sometimes like I said, the pacing can be a bit of a struggle, but I do like the fact they are a big event. It does feel like, compared to some of the shows in the State of Plays, it is appointment viewing for, I think, for a wider audience and perhaps more dedicated gamers as well. So I think that set the weekend up nicely. However, when it is wedged in between sort of two big first party showcases, and then you've got everything else. You had Future Games shown on Saturday night. You've got all these other indie showcases as well. We came into the office Monday morning. It's like, not knowing what to talk about because there's so many games being announced, so many events. I think it is perhaps, sometimes again just gets a little bit lost in just everything what's going on. It's difficult for any showcase or any game to stand out in this week. We know it's not E3 week, but there's so much going on.
Has this year's show changed your opinion, understanding of where Summer Games Fest finds itself in comparison to everything else? And from a publisher perspective, is that the show to shoot for? Or are you finding some of these others this year have actually yielded some great results for some of the companies that participated, even some of the smaller ones? Like you said, there's loads of them.
Yeah, I feel like it has reinforced its place in the calendar. I think it's basically the introduction to the weekend, isn't it? So as I mentioned previously, State of Play gets that little bit of a window on it. They always seem to get that little bit of a head start there. But I feel like, again, that Friday night appointment viewing, I think is a strong place. Its views are up compared to last year, so I think they will look at that. It's bringing more eyeballs than ever before, despite the strong competition, despite all of the showcases. I feel it has cemented its place. It's sort of in the calendar. It's obviously the first one of dress shows of the year as well. So it's sort of teeing up opening night live in about 6-7 weeks time now. So I think publishers will continue to look at it. I'm not sure moving forwards if it can continue to support 60 plus titles. I feel that maybe it could be a little bit of trimming moving forwards. We'll see. I think we get the question asked all the time, don't we? Which showcase should I be part of? And that's constantly changing. So I feel those questions will continue to be asked. And we mentioned earlier, how many could you remember? I think that's what it boils down to. How many of these are actually truly memorable? How many titles are actually being recalled by gamers and viewers?
Cool. Thanks, David.
No worries.
So, of course, this is just scratching the surface of everything in these reports. Of course, you're able to access these reports, purchase these reports. All you need to do is contact us either through our LinkedIn page, through our website, fancensus.com, or via email at info@fancensus.com, where it will go into much more detail than David has today, covering all the different data sets that we track at Fancensus, and of course, all the events, big and small as well, not just Summer Game Fest and some of the ones we've mentioned today. Any closing thoughts at all from a data perspective or from a gamer perspective?
I think you're wrong. It was an exciting show.
I stand by what I said.
It wasn't my favourite, I'll give you that, but it was an exciting show. I did enjoy it, and like you said, it was a good setup for the rest of the weekend. There were so many other little bits going on, and then Xbox towards the end, it was really quite nice sort of segue into that sort of mindset for the weekend. I
mean, this for me, why it's great, these showcases, because everyone's got an opinion, right? Because everyone is a different type of gamer. You guys play a lot more than I do. We're into very different games. So I think, everyone having a different opinion, different view on what went on, a different view on whether these have got a place, I think it's really good. And I think it's good for the industry. I think it's good for the showcases overall because it gets people talking, right?
I mean, it would be good as well if they could make the show better. I'd like that too. that would be nice. I'd be interested to know. I have looked online and seen what people are saying on forums, and I am seeing a mixture, as you always do, of this show was great or it almost like a backhanded compliment, saying like this was a great Summer Game Fest, which to me feels like, okay, you're not saying it's a great show, you're saying this is a good Summer Game Fest, and then you have people who have said, I mean, I couldn't watch the whole thing, and I still think 2 hours is too long. I mean, I get it because you're selling space, sure, but it makes the pacing suffer massively. But we'll probably be talking about this in a bit more detail in our next masterclass session. If you have any ideas or subjects that you want us to discuss in future masterclasses, by all means, feel free to reach out at the email address I mentioned earlier. But yeah, that's it until I suppose the potential Nintendo Direct that awaits this week, maybe. Who knows?
And obviously, we're already thinking about opening night live. It feels like one's out of the way, and then another big one's, just round the corner as well, and everything in between. So
Jeff does always seem to be somewhere nearby, doesn't he? On the calendar.
He won't be happy until he gets every month.
Yeah,
I feel. Got to catch them all. Okay then. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.